Something to note is that France never really had a huge military presence in Indochina. In fact, around this time, they only had about 11,000 troops in the entirety of Indochina. So how did they manage to conquer, colonize, and administer such a large region? Well, what they had to do was use local support, use people who lived there to act on their behalf because there were not enough French people in the area to run the economy. So the French relied on a small number of Vietnamese subjects to basically become local officials and work as bureaucrats. Most of the population saw these people as traitors. They saw them as collaborating with the French and assisting the French in shaming Vietnam. The French, on the other hand, used these people as propaganda. They showed them as success stories of their civilizing mission. They showed the benefits that they were providing towards these people and used it as a way to show that obviously French control was good. So why did these local people actually help the French and run the government for the French? Well, obviously most of them did it for self-interest. They were rewarded for helping the French. They were given positions of authority in local governments. They were given jobs in businesses or in economic institutions like the French Bank of Indochina. And some as well were rewarded through their children. Their children were allowed to attend French schools, receive scholarships to study in France, and those who really did help the local administration even received French citizenships. So there was a lot to reward the people who helped the French and who assisted them in running their colony. So before I mentioned that French Indochina was governed pretty haphazardly. What did I mean by that? I meant that it was governed pretty uneasily. Between 1900 and 1945, Paris sent over 20 governors to politically manage Indochina, which is a really, really high turnover, pretty comparable to the number of chancellors in Weimar, Germany. Each of them had different visions, different attitudes and approaches to how the colony should be run, and this resulted in a lot of changes in attitudes and approaches to managing the colony. So there wasn't a lot of consistency. The governors, officials and bureaucrats who ran French Indochina as well also had a lot of autonomy and authority. So they had a lot of power, but not a lot of oversight by the French government back home. What this meant is they could often do things of their own volition and wield even more power than they should have or was necessary. This kind of system encouraged a lot of self-interest on the part of governors, a lot of corruption, and a lot of heavy-handedness when it came to dealing with the population. They were often more interested in their own self-interests rather than what was best for the colony or even what was best for the people that lived there. The Nguyen emperors still remained as figureheads, much like how the Cambodian king remained as a figurehead, but they had very little power. They just held a symbolic role. Another thing worth noting, and this will become pretty relevant when we get to the Vietnam War later on, is that French rule was most direct and most obvious in South Vietnam. And they exerted a much greater influence on the people there, in part due to the fact that many more Vietnamese in the south of Vietnam were Catholics. Should also be noted that Vietnamese people who converted to Catholicism were a lot more ready to cooperate with the French. Some were given lands which were vacated by the French during the invasion, and some became quite elite and were able to send their children to schools to be instructed in French and to be able to eventually assist in the running of the French administration. Again though, I do have to point out that the top positions in French Indochina were held by people who were French. Vietnamese people were given the lowest level positions. One of the places in Vietnam which had the greatest French influence was in South Vietnam. It used to be called Saigon. It's now called Ho Chi Minh City. During the period of French occupation, there was so much infrastructure and French architecture built there that Saigon was actually nicknamed the Paris of the Orient, because some streets looked very similar to streets in that French capital. Okay, so looking back at French colonial rule, like I said, the main point that you need to keep in mind is that French administrators did see Vietnam chiefly as a source of revenue. That was the main reason that they were there. One of the main ways that they extracted profit from Vietnam was to increase the number of rice exports. So under the Nguyen dynasty previously, exporting rice and selling it to other countries had actually been forbidden. The Nguyens wanted to ensure that there was enough rice in Vietnam to meet the needs of the Vietnamese people living there. But under the French, thousands and thousands of tons were sold internationally. During this time as well, taxes also steadily rose, and they increased 10 times within the first decade of French control. This put a massive burden, particularly among the poorer sections of Vietnam. In order to further profit out of the countryside as well, the French government imposed monopolies on key things like opium, salt, and alcohol. This caused a lot of resentment because it meant that only the French government could produce these things, and they could sell them at a really expensive price in order to get a lot of profit. And you can see that some of these things are essential, they needed to be used, and other things, luxury items, would still draw a very high profit rate. And over the years, the French control of Vietnam and the number of laws which were imposed on its people grew and became more and more controlling and exploitative. So you can see the kind of nature of these laws from the ones that I've listed on here. Here are some of the laws which were applicable to all Vietnamese people. Vietnamese people were to be prohibited from travelling outside of their districts without identity papers, so they limited the freedom of their movement. They were not allowed to publish, meet, or organise because the French feared that they would stir up trouble, organise a protest or a rebellion against them. They were also subject to corvée, so that's the public works that I mentioned before. If anyone resisted working on these projects, if they resisted corvée as well, they could be forced to complete this work at the point of a gun. And additionally, Vietnamese people could also be imprisoned without a trial and just at the whim, basically the personal wish of any magistrate. The way that the colonial government enforced these laws was through a number of French and Vietnamese agents. Obviously the French were the more powerful ones, but the Vietnamese agents assisted. And in order to prevent real resistance to these policies, the French actually attempted to manipulate and divide the population so that they could not effectively unify to fight against this system. One of the main ways that they did this was they exploited cultural and language differences between regions. This was done to prevent different parts of Vietnam seeing themselves as a nation. That's also why they split the country into the 3 separate provinces of Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China. And as French repression grew, they attempted to stop any idea of national identity or authority at all. One French colonial law actually even stated that it was illegal to use the term Vietnam or to use the terms Vietnamese people. Now, the French did justify their rule in Vietnam by saying, look at all the economic progress we've made. Look at all the industries we've created, all of the wonderful buildings that we put up across the country. Look at the roads. We have economically modernized this area. It should be noted, though, that whatever economic progress Vietnam did make under the French really mainly benefited the French people living there and perhaps a small number of the wealthy Vietnamese people who helped the colony function. It did very little to assist the common people. In fact, it did a lot to harm, particularly peasants in Vietnam. So new areas of land were opened up to be cultivated for rice or corn and other things like that. However, peasants didn't really see an increase in food. In fact, they saw less food as most of it was being exported. So it's not like they suddenly enjoyed more food than they had previously before. Class divides were also enhanced, and there was a growing exploitation of peasants in the country. And you can see this in the figures of wealth inequality. So by 1930, more than 80% of rice land in the southern part of Vietnam, in Cochin, China, was owned by just 25% of landowners. This is a huge reversal to what it would have been a couple of hundred years ago, when different parts of land were mostly owned and worked on by families. Now you've got a situation where most people are working for others, not for themselves. And it creates a big underclass of people. They were called landless peasants, and they had to work on large estates for others. They were also subject to really heavy taxes and high interest rates. And this meant that they ended up very poor, that they were economically exploited and they had a very poor quality of life. Obviously, this led to a lot of dissatisfaction with the colonial rule, a lot of great bitterness, and it actually led to widespread peasant support for nationalists who wanted change, who wanted to kick out the French and to have a nation for Vietnamese people, run by Vietnamese people. One group who was particularly exploited under the French were the workers who worked on plantations which were established by the French government. Mainly these were rubber plantations. The workers who worked on these were known by the slang term coolies, and they had a pretty horrible job during that time. They worked long hours in really bad and dangerous conditions for wages that were tiny. Sometimes instead of being paid in food, they would just be paid in rice, just enough rice to get them through to the next day of work. The working day could be as long as 15 hours, without breaks, no food or fresh water. And even though French colonial rules actually prohibited corporal punishment, so prohibited the striking and beating of workers, many officials and overseers still did this anyway, because they knew the chances of being caught were quite small. So a lot of workers were physically harmed on the job. In addition, a lot of illness was spread through these plantations, things like malnutrition, because they weren't getting enough food, enough nutritious food. Dysentery and malaria also spread in great numbers as well. The conditions were so bad in some of these plantations that it wasn't uncommon to have several workers die in a single day. And just like in Cambodia, when it came to education, the French efforts to educate the population of Vietnam were really minimal. Keep in mind that they said that they had a civilizing mission, that they needed to teach modern ideas, ways of thinking to these people. The French did build some schools, but these were mainly for children of French administrators. The few Vietnamese people who were admitted to these schools were trained to work as interpreters for the administration or to work in low-level positions such as clerks or to work as administrators in Cambodia. Even so, the amount of Vietnamese people receiving education in these schools was tiny. Very few went on to secondary or tertiary education, and even by 1925, only 1 in 10 children was receiving any form of education under the French. And it should be noted as well that this is a change. Before French colonial rule, Vietnam actually had a really high rate of literacy. And under French colonial rule, literacy declined really, really sharply.